Greetings, students! Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to support this research on Patreon, and also to check out my new merchandise on Teespring. The links are in the description below. Now, today we continue our investigation into the hobo, with one eye forward and one eye... Is it floating off? Is it a lazy eye? No! It is monitoring the old-timers, keeping them in mind whilst we interrogate hobo culture for clues as to their identity. Though the hobo is localized to a place, America, and a time, the golden age of railroads, and though subject to periodic invigoration by specific 55-year cycles, as we established in our last video, it is not such a specific phenomenon as to share nothing with other groups. There have been wandering classes hosted inside of sedentary societies since some sedentary societies splintered off from hunter-gatherer populations in order to settle in the first place. By comparison with other itinerant groups, we might gain some insight into what the hobo precisely is, and why I am so drawn to this figure. There is a narrative of degeneracy following itinerant groups which goes through distinctive phases. Though any group at any one time may demonstrate only some parts of this cycle, the presence of the narrative in the perceiving public's consciousness confuses not only the story as we receive it, but the story as it unfolds between its participants. Here is the psychosocial mechanism by which that takes place. A man attends a carnival, attempts a game of skill, and loses. Because he believes already that carnies are degenerate thieves, he accuses the woman running the game of ripping him off. Because this aggression is unwarranted, and moreover, because it indicates a license for returning aggression, the carny laughs at him, as though she did successfully just pull off a con. The narrative is reinforced for the man, and the carny has learned that the consequences, if she were to actually cheat her customers, are not so dire. Perhaps before the next day's fair, she tinkers with her game. Or perhaps she goes out of her way to prove to later customers, before they engage, that she is, in fact, on the up and up. But these vehement denials tend to do more to subtly spread the original idea. Either way, the presence of the narrative tends to reinforce itself, except in cases where on either side of the fence individuals are able to ignore the stories they've heard, which is a rare skill in any time. So this psychosocial mechanism exists, but I haven't yet told you what story it is that we are reinforcing here. It is the story of the generation of the itinerant group. The story is not one with characters and a plot, unfortunately, but with two textures that interact in predictable, nearly chemical ways. The purest itinerant groups have taken vows of poverty, to hold no land, one is unbound to a set location, and indeed, if one is begging alms, then one might have to move on before the piousness of the local population thins. This type is known as the Mendicant. It has arisen in several forms over the years. The scourging monks of the plague years, the Franciscan friars begun in the 1200s. A millennium prior to that, we have a peculiar passage in a Buddhist holy text named the Maha Kanha Jataka that refers to Buddhist mendicants in terms that have some interest here. This Jataka, the 469th, tells the story of a time when mankind had lost religion. In an attempt to stir up a little of that holy fervor, a god reared an infernal black dog and took it to the capital city where lived the king. The dog terrified everyone, and the king, after offering up all the food in the city to try to sate the pup, asked what exactly was the deal here anyway. The god replied that he was going to let loose the dog to eat all of the sinners, if you'll excuse my ahistorical term. On inquiring what was meant by sinners, because you must recall this is a time when religion was scarce, the god gives a long list, but first in that list is this: when the false brethren, bowl in hand, in one robe clad, shall choose tonsured the plough to follow, then the black hound will I loose. This is remarkable. The supposed infraction was for monks to work. This recalls some of the idle chatter I've heard around the university commons of the contemporary, seemingly homeless beggars secretly having apartments and making a better salary than your average fast food worker. It is as though there has been this idea preserved, that anyone who asks you for a buck had better not have any other option, nor much success, lest they be consigned to the disreputable hell of cheats. But that is a sidetrack. The essential point here is that the monks were expected not to take up the plow, that is, not to work. They are, after all, meant to travel from place to place, tending to their monkish duties, not cultivating their own fortunes. It reminds me of an article I read in my Hobo research, a particularly sensational bit of yellow journalism entitled, "He is Bound by Strange Oaths." The article details the arrest of a man that they half-heartedly call Sam Lane, despite drowning us in alternative names and aliases in the first sentence. He was a hobo picked up as a potential suspect in a murder case. The strange thing, and the real selling point of the article, is that they claim this Sam Lane was in a brotherhood of hobos who were sworn not to do work. Could it be that Sam Lane and his associates were practicing the form of mendicancy to contradict which, by doing work, would have brought on calamity of the black dog? The newspaper fails to investigate the possibility. In any case, this most austere type of traveler is the height from which the others tumble down. Already in our earliest records of these groups, we have dire warnings of this tumbling. I invite you, my students, to consider that a warning is a way of telling the story of the things that we are warned against, and that on a certain level, we accept all stories that we hear as true. So, "Don't touch that frying pan or you'll get hurt" is on some level understood as, "I touched that frying pan, and I got hurt." "Monks shall not work lest the black dog be loosed" becomes, "The monks began working the fields, and calamity ensued." So what happens when holy groups that have sworn to do no work do indeed take up the plow? The spiritual forces with which they traffic give them access to strange technologies. This is implicit across many mythologies and explicit in a few, not least of which is that it is deeply embedded in the apocryphal texts of Christianity. The books of Enoch and Tobit describe the proximity to spiritual forces as being potentially exploitable towards scientific gain. Therein, illicit contact with angels gives mankind the secret of metallurgy, astronomy, writing, and, oddly enough, cosmetics. Who is better poised to exploit their angelic tutors than the mendicants who have oriented their entire lives toward cultivating a proximity therewith? And indeed, we see that precisely in the next phase of the itinerant group, the possessors of secret knowledge. On the mythic plane, this includes such groups as the Dactyls, Telchines, and Corybantes, who, demigods in their own right, taught metallurgy and initiation into the mysteries of Kibble and Rhea to humanity. These mythical metallurgists also had historical counterparts. This includes ethnic groups such as the Chalybes, Chaloi, Mosinoikoi, Tiboreni around the Black Sea, and even certain traveler groups today, with European travelers being renowned for their work in copper, and Irish travelers being known as all-around metalsmiths. As tight guardians of their technological secrets, the Chalybes et al. Had a relationship with the nearby societies that was not altogether one of co-identification. These traveling groups had a monopoly on a valuable asset due to their secret knowledge, and this gives them a natural allure. When the caravan was in town, you could come trade for new steel, but perhaps that's not the only reason you'd go. Perhaps you heard that there was drumming and dancing, and homage to the gods of a strange culture. I have another hobo example that fits the bill for this stereotype as well. In the book Hobo Campfire Tales by a man known as A Number One, a modest sort, the author relates a story. While he was hoboing, he encounters 3 youths in a field who ask him if he knows how to tattoo. A skill, I might note, with its own connections to magic and the occult underground. He did know how and offered to inscribe tattoos on the boys. As he completed these stick and pokes, he rapidly gauzed them up and told them not to take off the bandages or else the tattoo would not set. He did not tell them that what he had tattooed permanently onto those boys' bodies was his own name. Coming back through the town decades later, he noticed the tattoo on the hand of a man who served him a hamburger, and commented on it without revealing that it was he who had made the tattoo. The waiter told the story of having received it from a traveling hobo years earlier, and mentioned that if the guy ever came back, he was in for a surprise. The other two men had become the judge and chief of police in the town, so he'd be imprisoned for quite a long time. A number one luckily escaped before he was recognized. What is interesting in this story is not only how it refers to the tropes of traveling people using specialized underworld technologies, but also the fairy-like nature of the protagonist. Like the dactyls with one foot in the spirit world and one on solid ground, like a genie, he was asked for something, a tattoo, but delivered it on his own mischievous terms. It was a curse because it made the boys look foolish, but it also seems to have been a strange blessing. The men they grew up to be were some of the most successful in their town. And was it just the dirt of decades that hid a number one from being noticed? Or was he a bit of a shapeshifter himself? No longer a mendicant who is under the aegis of his god, the working, secret-harboring traveler is becoming a mythological being in his own right, and no longer supplicant to God and man, the one for grace and the other for alms, the traveler of this phase actively traffics spirits, as in the dactyls and telchines, and trades with the sedentary folks, as in the Irish travelers. The next phase of degeneration builds on the fascination that the dactyloi and their ilk begin to exhibit. Exhibit is the right word here, or perhaps exhibition. When the allure of the group exceeds its skill, the group can sell the allure as entertainment. Here we have the carny trope, or the wandering performers of the Punch and Judy show through early modern England. The alchemical skills that made the telchines frighteningly powerful have here been downgraded to something more suggestive. The sinister glamour of the stage magician, about whom we cannot with total confidence tell our children it is only a game. The hokiness of a palm reader who, nonetheless, gives a dead-accurate reading of your life. With the carny, we have the application of irony to the mysteries, but instead of undercutting them, it only obscures them further. The fourth and final phase of degeneration in the itinerant groups is criminality. A fine example of this type of narrative can be found in the flourishing of rogue literature in the 16th century. This genre comprised tales of thieves that much resembled A Number One's hobo campfire tales, down to the specialized lingo and the salacious first-person accounts. There are inflections of criminality implicit in the first three forms as well. Who sees a street performer, but their second thought is not that their pocket is being picked? What mendicant group has not suffered the accusation of exploiting faith for profit? But the bottoming out of itinerancy has its own more specific forms where it is centered in the form of itinerant criminal networks. The homeless pickpockets of Victorian crime fiction, those who meet in abandoned warehouses to plot their methods of avoiding work. Here we have a completely inverted view of the noble wandering mendicant. He has flipped from benefic dependent to active predator. To the illuminated mind, time does not exist, and the Illuminati work deeply in social engineering. There is perhaps something buzzing in this work. It might be called attention, but it is more dynamic than that. It is like a chemical potentiality. It exists in an imaginal space between the itinerant group and the sedentary population, and belongs properly to neither of them, but transforms them both. It is as though it is the small finger of some illuminated master mindlessly rearranging our worlds according to its whims. This is what I termed a psychosocial mechanism earlier in this discussion. The idea is difficult to express, which means we are in pursuit of a good one. Imagine a material. It is like paint, but it is clear. We will call it a paint. When a catalyst is added to it, it begins to change color. Depending on how long the catalyst is there, the paint progresses from red to orange to yellow and so on to violet. The paint is pooled in the center of a clock, and around the clock are inscribed the centuries of the human race. Are you with me? The catalyst is a dying wasp, or the spasming, dismembered finger of the illuminated master mentioned earlier, and it falls into the paint. As the paint turns red from the catalytic effect, it twitches and flings holy mendicants onto our 3rd and 15th centuries. The paint turns yellow, and the wasp spasms, flinging itinerant middle workers onto 600 BC and 1800 AD, and so on. The paint is the group's itineracy, and the catalyst is the suspicion that the sedentary populations harbor. The Illuminati is the nerve degradation in the wasp, or, of course, the finger of the master. But these other groups, the dactyls, the mendicants, and so on, they are bound by some of the most powerful forces that bind groups of people, ties of blood, ties of faith. Tight-knit items of identity cause a people to fuse, in a sense, and forge a culture. We have the same sort of highly developed culture coming out of hobos. They have their own language, customs, and currency. But what is it that binds the hobos together? Moreover, the mysterious powers attributed to certain of these groups tend to come from their proximity to foreign gods. But the same cannot be said of the hobo. And would that even be relevant to a 20th century American experience? With this theoretical groundwork and itinerant groups laid, the next episode we will perform a close investigation of the hobo, whence their authority derives, and what are the ties that bind them. And with that knowledge, we shall go on to analyze some products of hobo culture to lead us onward to discovering who were those old-timers, and what was their interest in America. Thank you for joining me, my students. If you enjoy this research, you can buy me a hypothetical cup of coffee on Patreon. The link is below. I have some merchandise available on Teespring. Please visit the link and buy some things for yourself and your friends, the community at large, whoever you think might enjoy it or whoever might not. Just go spend that money. Until next time, may the pyramid's eye watch over us all.